Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at this video. I don't really have much desire to introduce it, mostly because I actually I started recording it and then I remembered I'd fiddled around with my schedule. I've got to mention my schedule every single time I do a Patreon. Oh, I haven't done anything with my hair today. I'm losing motivation to do anything with my hair recently. Partially because I'm running out of like the hair product and I can't be bothered to get any more, so I'm like, just in the interest of putting it off, not doing my hair as much. Because this is what it looks like naturally, like very much fringy. I mean, it's fine, like I don't have a problem with looking like this, but I kind of prefer it. Well, I usually kind of do the thing where I like, you know, give myself a little bit of a parting, that situation. I think this makes me look more boyish, which is fine. I mean, I accept the fact I don't know why it is I look quite as young as I do, because I think I look very young for my age. I think it's because I stay very hydrated. I'm doing this video. What do the trans community need most right now? Abigail Thorne and Freddie McConnell. I didn't actually do a, like, hey guys, what do you want me to respond to? Like nominations, votes, things like that. Mostly because I thought, well, I only want this to be two parts. I'm sorry, but if you guys did vote for me to move on to something else, that would just annoy me, because I'm like, I might as well finish this. So I'm going to push to finish this. We have 28 minutes to get through, which is not nothing, but let's start. Let's begin.
The majority of Brits just either sort of are in favour of trans equality or like just could not care less. Whereas people like Kemi Badenoch are ideologically fervently opposed to our existence and recognition
Based
in public life.
I could kind of see. I don't know. I was going to say that I could see Kemi Badenoch getting in charge of the Conservative Party. Maybe that's not actually so realistic. I would really struggle to think of very many British politicians who do a good job as politicians. Even somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, who I like personally, and I like his policies, I think he did not project a very good image as the leader of the party, because I think he projected an image of weakness. So yeah, like, and that's someone that again, personally, I like him. His policies, I think, were pretty good, but he came across very weak. You would want, as a party leader, someone who is personally likable, who has good policies, and presents a message of competence and strength. Like, I can do this. And there really aren't any politicians who I can even think of who come close to that in the UK. I think, I think Obama had the likability and the kind of presentation of competence. And there are maybe a few American politicians, because I think America has more of a, like, kind of attitude. Like, I think America is just generally a more charismatic country. But yeah, also Kemi Badenoch, she did a really good, basically she was asked on some kind of BBC radio show, you know, if you want to ban women from if you want to ban trans-identified males from women's bathrooms, how are you going to do that? How are you going to enforce that? And she made the very obvious and I think very correct point of, well, we've never had the expectation that people need to bring paperwork with them for any rules that we have, even though we've always had certain rules about who should go in, essentially making the point that I've made before, which is actually this whole idea of how to enforce it is a bit disingenuous, because in terms of actual reality, just watch what happens and you'll see how you enforce it, basically. And I thought it was a good response. But yeah, Kemi Badenoch, whatever. I think she's kind of okay. I mean, I don't really agree with conservative policies in general, but yeah, just thought since she was mentioned, I'd give some thoughts on that.
I heard the story the other day where she was saying that cis girls in schools were getting UTIs because they were afraid to go to the toilet. Didn't provide any evidence for that. She just said it and it got reported. Like, you know, she can just say that and then, you know, include some stuff, other stuff about trans people being kind of whatever, threatening. I shared that story on my Instagram, and within an hour I had messages from two parents saying that their trans sons actually did have UTIs because they weren't using the toilet at school. That's the reality that I get in my inbox, and people are kind of...
So that's so bizarre to me, because you've got an official government minister saying this thing, presumably not based on nothing. I mean, you know, I guess it's just being taken for granted that for some reason, because Kemi Badenoch says it, like, and didn't provide an exact source or whatever, therefore it's made up. So that's supposed to be, like, just dismissed. Like, Kemi Badenoch says, oh, women are getting UTIs because they don't want to go to the toilet. And that's just dismissed for some reason. Because I guess we just assume that she had no reason for saying that. And then, well, I posted this to Instagram, and I got 2 people telling me, giving me personal anecdotes that say that their kids experienced that, and isn't that terrible? Like, I do not understand that mentality. That is such an insane thing to say, to be like, an official government minister, and I'm not saying because they're official government minister, that means what they're saying is the truth, but I am saying that it makes them at least as much as an authority as some third-hand account from a random trans activist saying, this is what some parents told me happened to their children. That's at least as credible, surely. Government minister saying women are getting UTIs because they're not comfortable going to the toilets because they don't feel safe, and like the toilets are a private space. And that's just dismissed. And then, but it's so terrible. I had someone tell me on Instagram this same thing happened to their kid. It's like, I can't believe that. That is like a thing, like a mentality to have. Like the lack of self-awareness and the lack of regard it shows to a particular group of people to tell the exact same story about the exact same thing happening with the exact same evidence. But the difference is, the people it's happening to, on one hand it's happening to trans people, on the other hand it's happening to women, to basically say, in one instance you can just completely dismiss it, who cares, and in the other instance to present it as if it is some serious issue. It genuinely unhinged.
Yeah, they have incredibly effectively euphemized all of this so that they can talk about it in ways that we recognize as very, very worrying and alarming.
I would absolutely disagree with that. I don't think that euphemism works to the advantage of the gender critical side. I don't think it's being used to work for the advantage of the gender critical side. And also, like, an example of euphemism is things like trans people should be able to live in peace and freedom and live as their authentic selves and things like that. These are all words that don't mean anything. But actually, I find, and I firmly believe it would be to the overall advantage of the broad kind of gender critical or trans critical movement to be very explicit about what we mean. To say, this is a claim about reality, we believe it's an incorrect claim about reality, and therefore, because there's no evidence that's been provided for it, and therefore, we are going to oppose any kind of effort to, on an institutional level, reify this reality, to bring this reality, or to rather bring this claim into being kind of a social reality through pretending it's true, basically. That's what we're opposed to. I think a lot of trans activists, they're obsessed with this idea of that people can go mask off. And I think the reason they do that, I've said this before, is because it allows them to essentially, by implying that, it means that people will not trust what gender critical people are saying, and anything gender critical people are saying, people will assume, what they're actually saying must be worse. And I've had people like, I'm very, very explicit about everything I believe about trans identity. I think it's wrong. I think it's an incorrect claim about reality, blah, 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 blah. I remember when I had that debate with Vorsh ages ago, he was like, just tried to get a yes or no answer on the question, like, is trans identity valid? And I was like, no, it's not, obviously. What's funny about that is it was almost saying it as if, like, it was something he was pinning me down on, as if it was something I was reluctant to admit. And of course, in reality, it's not something that I'm reluctant to talk about in very open, explicit terms at all. But again, with this mask off thing, and there were people even in the comments saying they're like, oh, he just went mask off there. Again, we can literally be as explicit as possible about this, and they will still be like using words like mask off and euphemism and things like that, because it's in their interest to act as if we are not being entirely honest about what we're saying, even when we are being entirely honest about what we're saying. But even though they'll continue to push this line of saying like, oh, you know, they're euphemism, mask on, blah, 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 we should still be very explicit about this. And I think for the most part, people are being very explicit about this. And I guess that kind of proves my point, because even as people are very clearly saying trans identity is a claim about reality, we disagree with that claim about reality, you still have people here saying, oh yeah, they're being really euphemistic, but we know what they're saying. Like, that's the thing, I could literally stand on, well, you know, I don't think I could, because I don't know if I'll get to this point, but I could be on, you know, national TV or whatever and say in very explicit terms, trans identity is a claim about reality. We disagree with that claim about reality. We think there's no evidence for it, and therefore we are basically opposed to it. We're opposed to the Gender Recognition Act, which says that officially trans identity is correct. These are all things to which we are unambiguously against. We think the Gender Recognition Act should be abolished, and that basically no trans-identified male should ever be allowed in any kind of woman's space, because it's a woman's space, and a trans-identified male or any biological male can never be a woman. And I could say all of that so explicitly. And you'd still have people being like, oh yeah, what he said there was a lot of very kind of subtle language and like euphemistic, and we could see that what he was saying was actually very transphobic, but he was trying to hide it. Like that's these people, I mean, I know it's not surprising because they don't think words should mean anything, but I really do think that's their strategy, to basically pretend that we are being far more euphemistic, again, that's the word that's been used all the time, and I'll repeat it again, euphemistic than we actually are.
And bigoted, but to sort of your average listener sound much more reasonable. So
okay, that's the thing. Okay, here's the issue, right? Because they'll say, oh, it sounds much more reasonable when they use this kind of language. What is basically being admitted there is that what we actually believe sounds reasonable, which is again why they have to do this strategy. Because if I said, trans identity is a claim about reality, in order for me to believe a claim about reality, that claim has to be evidenced. And because it hasn't been sufficiently evidenced, I therefore don't believe it. That sounds very reasonable. It's also a very clear, unambiguous, and pretty complete expression of what I believe on trans identity. The problem is, these people can't admit, well, what this person has done is just said what they actually believe, and it's quite reasonable. Instead, I'll have to say, well, that sounds reasonable, but actually this person has not fully communicated what they believe. That's why they have this strategy of acting as if we are in some way holding something back. And it's why it's really kind of desperate for them that they need to be able to pretend that's the case.
We'll never talk about trans people. They don't say the word trans.
Yes, they do.
Don't talk about adults. They just talk about children. It's like classic.
You can talk about adults. Plenty of people do.
Fear-mongering, moral panic stuff, and they also talk about gender identity, but they mean trans people. And obviously this, yeah.
Yes, we mean trans people. There's no ambiguity. Everyone understands this isn't something that's, you're not like uncovering something here. It's not like, did you know they actually are talking about trans people? Yeah, everyone knows they're talking about trans people.
The recent announcement has been correctly identified by many of us as Section 28 all over again, where you couldn't talk about gay people in schools. And that, I mean,
I've already done a video comparing it to Section 28, of course.
I don't think people realise that is what is being talked about, and it is a failure of our media that they aren't recognising that and being more challenging on it.
They, again, just this lie, but again, they have to lie like this, right? Because the reality is that when you hold the trans critical side to account, when you're honest about it, when you fully recognise what it is and you talk about what it is, you discover the reality is quite reasonable. So, in order to avoid the embarrassment of admitting that, these people have to say the media's failing to properly acknowledge what this is. Because otherwise they'd have to admit the media is successfully acknowledging what this is, and having the conversation that needs to be had, asking the questions that it would be appropriate to ask. The problem is, from the trans ideology perspective, the gender critical side is able to withstand those criticisms and properly answer those questions. So they have to pretend that there is some discussion that's not happening.
Once you accept the premise that you can deny a certain group of people their bodily autonomy over transition, why not abortion? Why not contraception?
Yeah. Exactly.
Why not IVF?
Yeah.
I believe that's called the slippery slope fallacy. I mean, like I've said this before, the key thing with the slippery slope fallacy is to understand, like, I made a video on this. It is possible, like I 100% agree that in somewhere like the United States, if there's not much, I was going to say carefulness, I guess that's a word, if there's not much care about how trans ideology is pushed back against, it may end up empowering some conservative Republicans who would want to then push further and ban abortion, and they certainly would use the fact that when it comes to, for example, children transitioning, they're saying this care, while it might be their bodily autonomy, it's harmful to children, therefore we're going to ban it. I could 100% imagine they will use that, like not they might, they will use that as a springboard for banning abortion. They'll say, well, this is also harmful for children, so sure, bodily autonomy, but it's about preventing harm to children. Absolutely 100%. But here's the key thing. Just because there is a potential slippery slope, just because the slope is slippery, doesn't mean you can't stick your feet in the ground, plant your feet in the ground and say, no, there is always, and again, this is what I said in my video that I've already made, which, I think a lot, like that's quite a popular video, but if you haven't seen it, I'd say it's a pretty good video. In any slippery slope scenario, there is always an argument that can be made for why you can stop here, wherever, and go no further, and be consistent. I remember I'm going to bring up Israel-Palestine, but in a pretty uncontroversial context, to be fair. Basically, it's partially because it's basically about Keir Starmer, and I was defending Keir Starmer, and I hate Keir Starmer. So basically, it was me just making a pretty obvious point. I was talking to a friend one time, and Keir Starmer was basically asked by a British racist, identitarian white nationalist. This British nationalist said, why don't we have a policy like Israel has, where Israel legally declares itself to be a state for the Jewish people? So why don't we legally declare the UK to be a state for Anglo-Saxon British people, basically, or Anglo-Saxon or Celtic British people, to basically, like Israel is officially, and I don't know whether or not it actually is, but officially declared to be a state for the ethno-religious group known as Jews. We should be a state for the ethnic group of English, Welsh, Northern Irish, Scottish, so on and so forth. And Keir Starmer, he didn't really give a good response at all to that question. But I said, well, he could have given a response. He could have said, for example, that the fact that there was the Jewish people have historically been dispersed in a diaspora and been persecuted largely because of the fact they've been a minority community everywhere. That does justify them declaring Israel to be a state officially for the Jews. Now, I don't agree with that, but he could have said that. But my friend said, no, he couldn't have said that. Like, no, like, just refuse. It's just like, no, you can't say that. There is no way you can possibly think that, Israel, declaring itself to be a state for the Jews could be justified without thinking that every single country should be able to make similar declarations. And, frankly, I disagree. And generally speaking, yeah, I think this idea of, like, hypocrisy and, the slippery slope thing, to me, it always speaks to a lack of creativity, because you can always say at any point, no, I support this, but I don't support this. And there will be an argument, and it will be a good argument. It might not be an argument that would personally convince me. It might not be an argument that would personally convince you, but it will be an argument that somebody could conceivably hold to for why they can say, I support this thing, but I don't support this thing. And of course, it's perfectly legitimate. Obviously, it's legitimate for anybody to say, I support banning medical transition in whatever context, but I think that abortion should be okay. And there's many arguments you can make for that. Of course, you could say that you do not consider a fetus in the womb to be a human being or a person who should even have their rights protected and things like that. Like, there's many arguments you can make to distinguish between these two things. So will conservatives use the one thing, like anti-trans legislation, to springboard to next? Absolutely, 100%. I offer my personal right now guarantee that will happen. But so what? There's lots of good policies I support, which I can imagine nefarious people with whom I disagree will use that, or would use that if we ever push these policies, would use that as a springboard for all sorts of other things. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop believing the correct thing, because that would be the slippery slope fallacy. If I said, well, because other people might use this push for other things, I'm not going to support this, even though I think it's a good policy.
My eldest child is about to go, he's in year 1, so he's got the kind of first year of where they actually talk about sort of not sex, but bodies, in an incredibly age-appropriate, sensitive way.
Year 1? Why do they talk about... I don't know why they'd even talk about that at all in year 1. Year 1, for those who are not from the UK, it's between the ages of 5 and 6. I mean, I'm not offended by it. Like, I think whatever, but I'm just like thinking, like, 5 or 6, like, how much can you actually even be age appropriate in terms of talking about that? And that is so far removed, like years 5 to 6. That's so far removed from any point where I would think you'd need to start talking about this stuff.
And I was going to go into the school to chat about how they're going to make sure that families like his are included, because I gave birth to him. I'm trans. He's only got one parent because we use donor sperm and all this sort of stuff. And then like the next day, that news landed of like, we're not going to teach kids about gender identity. Current guidance from... The guidance said they would teach about the reality of medical transition, and they would teach about like diversity in terms of
sexual orientation and things like that. So there's no reason to think that they wouldn't teach that it's possible for, I guess, somebody who has transitioned such that they look more typically like a biological male would still be able to give birth based on the reality that they are in fact biologically female. There's no reason to think they wouldn't teach about that. They just wouldn't say that this biological female who's given birth is in fact a man because of their belief of being one.
There's always this constant rolling moral panic
Yeah.
about censorious behaviour in schools and students not being taught about certain bits of history because they're going to be triggered or whatever. And I know there's a certain futility in pointing out the hypocrisy of these people because they don't care about being hypocritical. But it is frustrating to listen to weeks and weeks of this generation.
Okay, so I want to address that. So is there a hypocrisy between somebody thinking... So what was that there? It was basically, I think he was saying... See, it's one of those things where, like, I'm trying to rephrase it, and I can't rephrase it in a way that makes it sound remotely sensible, because what I wanted to say there was, some people think there are certain things that should be taught in school and certain things that shouldn't. But when I say that, and that's basically what Nish Kumar, what he was saying just then, I realise that's such an obvious thing that some people think. Of course, pretty much everyone thinks there's some things that should be taught in school, and there's some things that shouldn't. Obviously. So what I'm going to try to do now is make that sound less stupid as a thing to say. And I guess what you were saying there is some people are against the idea of teaching about certain things because it could be politically offensive. And I guess what he's talking about there is things like critical race theory, maybe.
Students not being taught about certain bits of history because they're going to be triggered or whatever. And I know...
Oh, okay, so yeah, that does make sense. So what he's actually saying there is that basically it's more about the idea that there are certain things that conservatives want to be taught. Again, I'm just going to say conservatives, because I guess that's what he's talking about, want to be taught, but aren't taught because people get offended. And now he's saying, well, conservatives are offended by the idea of trans identity being taught. So that's hypocritical. But again, I mean, I refer you what I've said before about how I generally think this idea of hypocrisy, it's usually a bad criticism that speaks to a lack of imagination. Because there absolutely, of course, there are reasons why somebody might think certain facts about history should be taught regardless of who they offend. Whereas by contrast, something like trans identity does not need to be taught at all because it's not a fact. I mean, the big thing here, of course, is that the objection to trans identity being taught is not really framed in terms of a moral outrage. It's framed in terms of it being a contested claim about reality. That's the specific wording that the government used. So, yeah, this is not hypocrisy. But even if you got it to the point where these were two pretty comparable things, so what? Like I say, it's possible for even two comparable things for somebody to have very different views on them and still be consistent in having those views.
They can see trans people. They can read the things that we write and see the things that we make. Like, if they like Star Wars, they're going to see me in it. Like, come on. Like, unless you're going to ban that, like, what are you going to do?
Again, so this is like, you obviously have a straw man situation here, acting as if the desire is to stop people from being aware that trans-identified people exist. No one has any interest in stopping people. I want trans people to be aware trans-identified people exist because I want people to understand that the claims they're making are nonsense. Nobody has said that people shouldn't be aware trans-identified people exist. They shouldn't be taught that there is such a thing as gender identity that actually has an effect on people in reality. Yeah, it's really that simple.
Or is it more frustrating to hear a statement like that is filled with sort of caveats?
If a cis person doesn't need permission to get married in the right gender, I don't see why I should either. I certainly don't see why.
Okay, look, I want you to understand. A cis person has no concept of getting married in the right gender. That's, like, I didn't need permission. You're right, I didn't need permission to get married in the right gender. Because I didn't want to get married in the right gender. I wanted to get married, and the reality is I'm a biological male, I'm a man, and as for my gender, I'm, some varying degree of masculine, and, it's not something I feel particularly obligated to perform, except for on a subconscious level. But none of that's relevant to me having been married. You're just talking nonsense.
Yeah, no, I definitely would rather they just shut the fuck up rather than come out with like half-baked, ill-conceived. Like, why are they feeling the need to...
I mean, to be fair, like, same. Like, I wish Labour... Like, again, this issue, there's so many issues like this, where I was talking about this recently with, this is kind of off topic, but I'm going to talk about it anyway, with like asylum seekers, where there was a thing recently, and it drove me up the wall, which is a conservative politician was talking about illegal migrants coming in claiming asylum but crossing the English Channel on boats, and basically said, well, you know, what we want is for people to enter this country through the legal mechanism, and to claim asylum through the legal channels available for people to claim asylum. And I do agree with that. Of course, it's not good for people to be crossing illegally, because ultimately what that does is it funds human trafficking, which, of course, human trafficking is really evil. And while, yes, in a way, you could say if a migrant family that really needs asylum and really needs to escape their situation is able to get out, and it's a situation where their asylum would have been seen as legitimate anyway, their claim for asylum would have been seen as legitimate anyway, that's fine. But of course, human trafficking covers all sorts of other areas. So that's why normalizing the idea that illegally crossing into the UK is the correct way to go about claiming asylum is a bad idea, because it basically legitimizes human trafficking as an industry. Of course, but this conservative was then asked a very simple question. All right, so let's say I'm in Senegal or whatever, and I want to claim asylum. How do I go about doing that legally? And the conservative politician, whoever they were, completely fell apart. They had no idea. And to me, that's insane. But then what you have to remind yourself is that there's so many people in the political class who say things and they don't even care enough about what they're saying to actually have thought through the actual substance of what they're saying. So obviously I say it for migrants, where some would say, because yeah, like that is a thing that it would make sense to say, you know, what we want is people to use the legal mechanisms. But of course it should follow from that you are then aware of what the legal mechanisms are. Because if you care enough about this and you're a politician, you care enough about the migrant issue to be saying this stuff, to be saying it's really important people take the legal mechanism, you should be able to provide at least some sort of explanation of what the legal mechanism is. And as far as I can tell, there really isn't much of a obvious and easily navigable legal mechanism to claim asylum to enter the UK. So in that context, I absolutely don't blame anybody who wants to claim asylum to the UK going the illegal route and, you know, traveling across the Mediterranean up through Europe and then getting a boat across the English Channel. You can't be surprised people are doing that, because what's the legal mechanism? That's the issue. But then, of course, it applies to trans identity as well, where I think a lot of politicians are saying things about the issue, but I don't think they're saying it from a position of actually caring what they're saying. And that's the explanation for why they're so inconsistent on it. And that's definitely what Labour have been doing. Like, sometimes they'll talk about protecting women's spaces. Other times they'll talk about protecting trans rights. But in both cases, it seems like they're saying those two things because then they know that those are things that sound good to certain people. But of course, what we can see in reality is that in neither case is there any actually sincerity. These people aren't saying they want to protect trans rights because they actually have a meaningful conception of what trans rights are and why they support trans rights and why they think trans rights is a legitimate goal in the first place. And they're definitely not saying that they support women's sex-based bases. I think in that case, they probably understand why that is a legitimate goal, but I don't think they genuinely care about it. But that's of course why they're being inconsistent. And that's why, you know, I'll see trans activists post things like how they're not going to vote Labour because Labour is so evil and transphobic. And my instinct is to like those posts because I like, even though I disagree with trans activists, I like the fact that they recognise that Labour are dishonest, disingenuous about this stuff. So even though I wouldn't say Labour's transphobic, I mean, I'd say that Labour spends too much time pandering to trans ideology. But I can also completely understand that when you look at the ways that Labour have also disingenuously pandered to gender critical sentiments on some points, talking about protecting women's spaces and things like that, why trans activists would feel the same. And of course, Labour for that unfortunately they won't be, they'll probably win the next election, but they need to be punished for that. Because how can you vote for a party that is very obviously just saying things that they think will get them elected with no regard to whether or not those statements are actually true.
Basic self-ID is just self-determination, which is a fundamental right, and that is what we need.
No, because the difference is determination is a thing that you can do, whereas identity is a claim about reality.
We don't need the state to be able to decide who we are. We can do that.
No, you can't decide who you are. You can be wrong about who you are, and that would make you wrong. If you can decide something, then you can basically choose it, and in choosing it, it becomes the case. But you can't do that about identity. You can't choose to be black and become black.
20 plus countries now have these laws, and there's no evidence that it has any harmful impact on it.
It does have a harmful impact on reality itself, on truth itself. If I said there are 20 countries that have a law officially declaring that the earth is flat, maybe there's no harm that comes from that. Maybe, it hasn't caused riots, it hasn't caused death, it hasn't caused health issues. It's just 20 countries where everyone's declared the earth is flat. There's still a harm there, which is that now 20 countries have a law on the books which says something fundamentally untrue about reality.
Anyone. Germany is going to be the latest. Their law is coming into effect in August this year.
The Euros are going on in Germany right now. So are we going to start seeing when the women's Euros come up, when the women's European champions come up, are we going to have the German men's team temporarily identifying as women?
The name system in this country is really interesting. You can change your name by just saying you've changed your name. You don't even need a deed poll.
Right.
Yeah, of course, because your name is not a claim about reality. Like, that's obvious. Like, I could, if I decide, obviously my name is Michael already, so I could be Michael Mikey. So, and that's not, you could say, well, that's not really changing your name. But, obviously, I can decide whether I'm called Michael or Mike. None of this is a claim about reality. But of course, if I decided suddenly that I wanted to be called Dave or Joe, that's fine. Because I'm not making a claim about reality there. Whereas if I suddenly decide, again, the transraciality, if I decide I'm black, that's wrong. If I decide I'm 52, that's wrong. If I decide that I'm from the planet Venus, that's wrong. There's a difference between a name and a claim about reality. If I decide I'm a woman, that is wrong. That is a claim I'm making about reality and it is incorrect.
So I guess that's fine. That's, there are ways in which that could presumably be abused, but we don't get rid of it. We don't say we need to protect.
Well, okay, again, in terms of being abused, I don't see how it can be abused because it's not making any sort of substantial claim that impacts anything.
So-and-so group, it's, I don't get it because the Conservative Party especially is meant to be in favour of personal freedom and less interference from the state. And literally, this is what they are saying.
Speaking of interference,
to be fair, there's definitely examples, for almost every single, political ideology you can say. For example, the Conservatives, what are they supposed to be about? Conserving. So shouldn't they be, environmentalists logically? But they're not.
Sometimes I don't know who's more dangerous in some ways, the kind of hardline ideologues or someone like Sunak still willing to weaponize and mobilize against that community because he's trying to.
This is an interesting line of inquiry from the opposite perspective. Who is more dangerous, the hardcore trans ideologues or people like Keir Starmer, who's willing to kind of sign off on a lot of their nonsense and basically pander to it?
No, because you used the word independent. And I think the very first thing we need to talk about when we mention the Cass Review is that it deliberately excluded trans people from all of its governing boards, several members of its advisory board.
Why would that make it not independent? I think you're confusing independence with impartiality.
But it's not genuine. I think I was reading the transactional briefing on it and it sort of just pointed out that saying something is independent does not make it independent.
How can you say that? How can you say that? How can you, a trans activist, saying something is something doesn't make it that thing? They so lack self-awareness, it's insane. Oh, that's so funny. Goodness me, that's hilarious.
And that it exists to be cited rather than actually read. They've already decided.
That's why I don't care about it, right? Because, as far as I'm concerned, I don't need a report to tell me that a biological male can be a woman. So it's kind of, from my perspective, it's not so much that I don't care about reading it, although I don't really care about reading it. But it's also the fact of I don't really concern myself with what the Cass report says, because I knew that a biological male couldn't be a woman long before a bunch of doctors got together and wrote a little report about stuff. So, yeah, that just seems like basically it's more irrelevant from my perspective.
It's just euphemizing in order to hide it. Just sort of they wouldn't call it conversion. They wouldn't accept that characterization of it. They would say it's
Gender
talking
exploratory therapy is the
it's
new
exploratory.
euphemism.
Well, the thing is, it's not so much I wouldn't accept it. What I would say, a bit like transphobia, conversion therapy at this point is just a meaningless term, because it can, again, and this is the problem. Unfortunately, recently the Communist Party of Britain released a statement where they said they're against conversion therapy in all forms for gays and lesbians. So that doesn't even relate to trans identity. Because when you talk about trans identity, that's a whole different question. But even being against conversion therapy as it relates to gays and lesbians, I think it's wrong to be against it. And the LGB Alliance has said that they don't really care about conversion therapy for lesbians and gays as a concern. The big point to stress is that anybody who complains about conversion therapy, there are two things they complain about. One, the fact that somebody is being taken to a place without their consent, and two, that they're being physically tortured. They'll say, people are taken to camps and they're given electroshock therapy. All right, yeah, obviously it should be illegal to kidnap someone and torture them with electricity. That should already be illegal. The problem with this idea of a conversion therapy ban is there is no argument I've seen given for why we need to specifically invent this idea that there is such a thing as conversion therapy that can be easily identified and say we're going to make that illegal. Because the problem is, right, one, there are so many, and again, I don't have a problem with people being same-sex attracted, but there is an association between past trauma they've had and their current sexuality. That is like an idea that some gay people will tell you. So to say to those people, with there being some gay people who say that, to say to those people, you are not allowed to undergo therapy that might carry with it the possibility that your attitudes towards sexuality could change. That's issue number one. Issue number two is, once you start talking about like gay and lesbian, what about asexuality? Because then you open up a whole can of worms, because there are many medical reasons why somebody might not have a sex drive that could be changed. I'm not going to say cured exactly, but certainly changed by therapy. So is that conversion therapy? And then, of course, you've got the fact of, let's say, there is someone who is religious, and it is their right to be religious, and their particular religion thinks that same-sex attraction is immoral. So they say, in a meeting with their pastor, which may for them be quite therapeutic, could you, pray for me that I am able to overcome this same-sex attraction? And I mean, just to make it a bit less controversial, what if it's a man who's already married? Well, in that context, of course, he needs to stay committed to his marriage. Like, any Christian should agree that if you are, if you are a man who gets married to a woman and then you start struggling with same-sex attraction, there's only one route there. You can't do the scummy kind of Philip Schofield thing where you abandon your wife and your kids and everyone celebrates that. You have to stick with your marriage, obviously, because that's what marriage is. Let's say, again, you're a married man, you are perhaps religious, and I mean, you might not even be religious. You might just, based on kind of a normal secular morality, recognize this is a bad thing, and maybe you go to a church because that is an environment where you know that you can kind of ask for advice about this stuff. But essentially, you recognize that your same-sex attraction would then lead to you abandoning your wife and your kids, and you can't do that. So you say, hey, could you help me, pray for me, whatever, to overcome this? Well, now that's conversion therapy. But just in general, it's kind of funny because these people talk about like freedom, bodily autonomy, whatever else. I think people should have freedom. I think people should have the freedom. Like, if you are, I mean, look, if you're a gay or a lesbian, it's weird because I can say a lesbian and that's fine. But if you say a gay, that sounds weird. But sometimes I just say a gay or gays because I would say lesbians or whatever. Anyway, if you're a gay person or a lesbian, I don't know why you would ever feel like you want to undergo therapy that could potentially change your sexuality. I don't know why you would do that. But if you want to, for whatever reason, that's not my business. Especially because I don't know anything about the same-sex attracted experience. Maybe you are someone for whom, and again, this is the case for certain same-sex attracted people, feel that there might be some past trauma that has caused you to have that particular sexual attraction. That is a thing that there are definitely plenty of same-sex attracted people who will say that. Maybe that's you. But who knows what it is? It doesn't really matter. The point is you should have a right to determine your own healthcare for yourself on that point. And of course, it's massively hypocritical that these people think on this point you should not be able to determine your own healthcare. But the key point in general is that when it comes to banning conversion therapy, there is nothing harmful that it stops. Because the only harm would come from people against their consent being forced to undergo treatment that is basically torture without any right to kind of resist or anything like that. But that's already illegal. So aside from that, what are you banning here? You're banning people choosing of their own accord to undergo therapy that is not in any way physically harmful to them. I don't see why we should ban that. So yeah, I don't know.
Right, okay.
But obviously the problem is with all of this stuff is it starts from a position of being a trans adult being sort of not a desirable outcome.
Yeah.
So it's never neutral.
Well, again, like there's so many side effects that come from being trans-identified as an adult. Of course, people aren't going to think that's desirable.
I'm glad you mentioned conversion therapy, though, because there's an ongoing effort by conversion therapists to get ahead of a ban by rebranding as exploratory therapy, gender exploratory therapy, which is just conversion therapy. That's not just my opinion. That's also the opinion of some medical professionals who've...
Look, again, see, all you're showing there, by showing that you can rebrand this and blah, like by talking about branding, the fact they're talking about branding shows why this whole concern about conversion therapy is completely nonsense and manufactured. The reason why it concerns them that a lot of this could be reframed as explorative therapy is because at that point there will be nothing they can point to, because the only thing about it they can point to say this is bad is that it's a scary word. Otherwise, there's nothing you can point to about a free, independent person who's making their own choices saying, hey, I want to go down this therapy to explore something about myself, which for whatever reason I have feelings about that make me think maybe therapy could help. I don't understand this like paternalism that makes people think that they have any right to imagine like, oh, well, that person can't actually want that particular therapy. That person can't so strongly feel that way about their own life. Like, how do you know how someone else feels about it? I don't understand it.
To say that young people now are free from gender stereotypes and then to imply that makes them more likely to be trans and to want to conform to gender stereotypes, because like what she's saying is that if a young girl is masculine or butch, like she's going to be more like, she's going to think that she has to be a man. That's not being free from gender stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. But that's what a lot of you people are implicitly pushing. Philosophy Tube is the person who literally said, basically, words to the effect of, you can escape masculinity as a man if you transition to being a woman. Presenting it as basically the only option to escape such masculinity.
Outside of the media conversation and the political conversation, that wider society's attitudes are changing and shifting.
Well, they've always been quite positive. I think they've always been around there, and it might have been affected.
That's a good point. Basically admitting this isn't really a progressive thing. Like pretty much for as long as people have understood trans identity as basically, like again, even in the 1950s, there were those like the articles like XGI becomes blonde bombshell. People were always willing to entertain trans identity because they understood it as sexist stereotypes, and a lot of people sign off on sexist stereotypes. So yeah, it's correct to recognize that pretty much the acceptance of trans identity, this idea of biological males being women, has been something that it's ebbed and flowed, but there's not like a clear trajectory of progress because it is not a progressive movement, basically.
I'd like to have conversations about who's going to resign over this. I'd like to have conversations about apologies and public memorial.
It is really interesting that Philosophy Tube is so stuck on this point of someone has to be punished. It's so interesting. Like Philosophy Tube's constantly coming back to this point of, who's going to be punished, who's going to be fired, who's going to go to prison, who's going to. Just all that kind of language. I don't know. I find it interesting that that's the specific point of focus.
I mean, there are so many things that we as trans people and the trans community more broadly have to teach wider society about gender and about equality. I am really frustrated often by the fact that we don't get a platform to do that. And we,
You have so much of a platform. You just don't. What you're saying, right now you have a platform and I've listened to you talk. I mean, I'm kind of letting it play a little bit because I want to get to the end, and in theory, we've only got 1 minute until I want it to stop, but I'm going to let it play out. But yeah, just they haven't said anything. A lot of talk about how people need to be punished for daring to stand against them. But yeah, no arguments.
No offense, but that's just the way it is. It's we have to come out and we have to correct, and we can't ever add anything new to the conversation. And actually, there are so
you can. No one's stopping you, but you just don't have anything to add.
I think the perception is that there aren't sort of trans-specific organisations out there, and obviously there are.
I mean, kind of, because you just steal all of the organisations for lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. But no, the reality is, even while you're stealing the organisations specifically for lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, you are simultaneously. You simultaneously have your own organization specifically for you. It's like how you have a trans flag that you use just for yourself, but God forbid a gay person ever use the rainbow flag just for themselves.
I sort of feel queasy about the fact that we've had this conversation to begin with, because I feel uncomfortable about the idea of bringing people onto a show and forcing you essentially to defend your identity and who you are. And
I would have zero discomfort about saying, hey, that claim you made about reality, you just claimed who you are, and that is a claim that you're making about reality. I think actually there should be some expectation that you're able to defend that. If anything, surely there should be more expectation, because if someone says something about something they don't really know about, well, maybe the expectation they'd be able to defend that. They're not going to be expert. Whereas if someone's saying, this is who I am, they should be able to defend that, because otherwise, I mean, if they can't even argue that it's true compellingly, how can they claim that's something that they know about themselves?
Now, if you have any heroes that you want to shout out or any other comments you want to share,
well, that's that. So there we go. I don't care. I don't care about anything that was just said. It was all nonsense. The Philosophy Tube is boring, and the whole thing's a waste of my time. And I regret having just spent the last hour making my way through that. My favourite parts were every time that I spoke about anything that wasn't really directly related to what was being said, like when I went off on a bit of a rant about immigration policy and how Labour are dishonest and how the whole push to ban conversion therapy is pretty much indefensible nonsense. Anyway, I'll see you all next week. I hope you did enjoy, and of course you can. I will do a little nomination thing for what's to be done in next week's video. But of course, you're also welcome to make some nominations yourself in the description here. See you all later. Bye!